These are the moments that shook mixed martial arts to its very core. Not all MMA debuts are built equally, and for our money, the first walk to the octagon of the great Royce Gracie was a moment that not only affected MMA's future tremendously, but it also changed martial arts forever. Gracie was the smallest fighter in an 8-man bracket, and yet the entire existence of this Ultimate Fighting Championship event was seemingly to prove the superiority of the Gracie family's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighting system. Royce was selected from the family as he was the smallest, not the muscle-bound force that was Rickson Gracie. The idea was to show the world that you didn't need size to beat a bigger opponent. Gracie Jiu-Jitsu would be enough, and boy did they prove their point. Royce dominated his competition, beating fighters from many different backgrounds to firmly establish BJJ as a force to be reckoned with on the martial arts scene. From there, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu gym enrollment numbers went through the roof. Through a lot of the 90s, the UFC was billing itself as a no-holds-barred fight sport, where time limits were absent, groin shots and hair pulling was allowed, and the game just seemed to lack the type of structure that would allow it to be fully accepted by the masses. Thankfully, the unified rules of MMA changed this forever. And with the implementation of 5-minute rounds, firm stances of fighter uniforms, and a total outlawing of unsavory moves like groin shots, MMA was taking one step closer to mainstream approval. The united rules went hand in hand with the Zuffa takeover at the turn of the century. Just like the rule changes, the UFC needed a different leader at the helm of the ship before it could truly attempt to drop its reputation as a seedy, underground organization. Enter how influential these three men were in dragging the UFC into a different realm of popularity. And with Dana firmly instated as the president of the promotion, we slowly watched these guys defy the odds time and time again, building this fringe fighting organization into one of the most sought-after sporting companies of its era. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. This one is a multi-pronged entry. Part of the thing that made mixed martial arts so appealing in the early 2000s was the wide range of choices when it came to fight events week to week. The UFC were obviously at the forefront, but you also had Pride making waves in Japan, Strikeforce and the WEC on US soil, and many other promotions that prevented a one-company monopoly. But as the 2010s rolled in, the UFC started buying up all the competition, absorbing Pride first and then taking the entire rosters of WEC and Strikeforce and making them their own. Sure, this led to one insane group of fighters competing under the same promotional roof, but for one company to have that much power, it marked a huge shift in the industry. Dana White once boldly declared that women would never have a place in the UFC.
Yes. When are we going to see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Never? Never? All right, have a good night, man.
Thank you.
At that time, he didn't have Ronda Rousey to contend with over in Strikeforce. Because even though there was no real reason for him to bring women on board when he made this statement, as soon as Rousey began establishing herself as a legitimate draw in a rival organization, Dana changed his mind very fast. Shortly after, Ronda was brought on board, not only became the biggest star in the company, but she single-handedly kicked open the door for women's mixed martial arts in the UFC. Her opening fight in the bantamweight division against Liz Carmouche was a huge deal at the time, and as the years went on, the 135 division was eventually joined by the 115, 125, and 145-pound divisions. If there was no Rousey, who knows how long it would have taken Dana to change his mind. Money talks, folks. Speaking of big money signings, when the UFC decided to bring in a young Irish 2-weight promotional champion from Cage Warriors in 2013, they clearly knew that they had something special on their hands. The guy could talk, he had the look, and his ability to find knockouts was truly immense. But there's absolutely no way they could have predicted just how well Conor McGregor would do once he found his momentum. Rousey was a big star for the promotion, yes, but if she opened up a path for the UFC to move towards mainstream acceptance, McGregor broke that door down completely, changing the sport forever. This first-round knockout of Marcus Brimage was a nice way to kick off his account, but the true victory here would have lasting ramifications for everyone involved. Dana White, Conor, and the UFC were about to make more money than they ever dreamed of. In about a decade and a half, the Fertitta brothers and Dana White had turned what was a pretty small investment into a hugely profitable business venture. And by the time 2016 had come, the UFC was sitting right at the forefront of the sporting world. So when WME-IMG came with an offer of $4.2 billion to buy out the Fertittas, Lorenzo and Frank decided to take the money and step aside. Dana, who also profited hugely from this buyout, still managed to keep his UFC president role and, of course, his salary. along with a chunk of the selling fee that numbered in the hundreds of millions. WME-IMG represented yet another step into the mainstream world, with the William Morris Company providing a range of new business connections that would totally change the UFC as a brand. This one was controversial, but you really can't understate how much of an effect it had. Prior to the UFC's deal with Reebok, fighters were totally free to wear customized shorts with various sponsors and design choices. This allowed them to make way more money for themselves outside of their fight purse. But when the UFC opted to make a deal with Reebok, all of that went out the window. It now became mandatory for fighters to wear the same fight kit as their colleagues, removing all ability for them to seek out sponsors for their kits. Instead, they received measly payouts from Reebok based on how long they were in the company. Simply put, Reebok got rich, the UFC got rich, and the fighters ended up getting the short end of the stick. A huge moment for the UFC, but this and the subsequent Venom deal that followed marked an unfortunate shift in the sport. The days of watching MMA on random channels like Fuse or Spike are long gone. And when the promotion announced that they were moving their broadcasting entirely to ESPN, it proved just how far of a push into the mainstream they had made. For most casual fans, this simply meant that they could get their fill of fighting content from one trusted source. But in reality, the UFC were now obligated to put on a certain amount of events per year, and their payment from ESPN was a flat fee no matter how it performed. Of course, higher selling shows would result in more money, but lower level events like Apex shows would now become the norm. With this, the roster size increased. You began to see fight night events being headlined by guys who wouldn't even make the main card of a solid PPV. The ESPN deal was a good thing in many ways, but it definitely changed the game. And finally, the idea of a UFC pay-per-view doing over 2 million buys was a truly alien concept in the early 2000s. But when Conor McGregor came on the scene, it genuinely seemed like anything was possible. Khabib Nurmagomedov was the perfect dance partner in this battle, a polar opposite to McGregor in every sense. And when UFC 229 Fight Week came around, it became clear that this was a rivalry unlike anything we had ever seen. And unbeknownst to us all, Khabib would be the one to totally steal the show, beating McGregor confidently and then outshining the showman with a dramatic dive into enemy territory post-fight, kicking off an insane brawl that no one saw coming. 2.4 million pay-per-view buys is a record that it will take the promotion a long, long time to beat.